And now to introduce our speaker for tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carver Clark Gayton. I believe we first met when you visited in 2015. We were delighted that you immediately became a member of the organization, and we were a little starstruck when you talked to us about your book, and we were so excited to get it. So it was a pleasure having you with us tonight from long distance. I will let Mr. Gayton introduce his genealogical connection to Oberlin because that is the joy of the story. But Dr. Gayton grew up in Seattle and has a varied and amazing life story that I'm only going to be touching on the surface right now in my introduction. But key words include playing and coaching during the Rose Bowl, serving as the first Black FBI agent from the state of Washington, being a director of affirmative action programs, teaching public administration, working in corporate education relations, consulting, lecturing, and serving on multiple boards. He was also the executive director of the Northwest African American Museum. He graduated from the University of Washington with a BA in history, worked toward an MA in educational administration from Temple University, and earned an MA in public administration and a PhD in political science from the University of Washington. And we are honored to have you here with us tonight, all the way from Seattle. So it's interesting, the pandemic gives us these unique opportunities. So thank you so much for sharing your history with us here tonight.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, I really appreciate the invitation to speak with the group this evening. I remember that time when I came, to visit, had a great time, got to learn, a lot more about Oberlin, and I'll talk about this too, and that is that my great grandfather and my great grandmother are buried in Oberlin, so I have a close connection, with Oberlin. But what I'm going to do, as you indicated, I'm going to provide some highlights of my book, When Owing and Shilling Costs a Dollar. That to find out what that means, you will. It would be great if you could purchase a book, but I'm going to talk more about it later on. It's truly an American story about Clarke, about an exceptional man. But even though it's an American story, it's a story that is not really well known within the United States. But anyway, I hope that situations like my great grandfather's will be better known as we go through stories like this. So what I'm going to do is provide a short introduction and overview of his life, and then Liz is going to help me have some significant pictures as it relates to individuals and places and during his lifetime that are relevant to the story. And then at the end of that, we'll open it up for questions, as Liz has pointed out. Well, Lewis Clarke, my great grandfather, was born into slavery and was separated from his Scottish father and quadroon mother at the age of 6 in Madison County, Kentucky. The atrocities that he suffered and witnessed were abominable and way beyond what most slaves endured during slavery. He ultimately escaped from slavery and traveled to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and became a primary spokesman for the abolitionist movement during the 1840s and 1850s. While in Cambridge, he lived at the home of Aaron and Mary Safford, where he met many times with Harriet Beecher Stowe, Mary's stepsister, as well as many other luminaries of the abolitionist movement, during that time. The rebellious quadroon slave George Harris of Mrs. Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was identified by her as based significantly upon the life of Clarke. When the Civil War ended, Clarke continued to be in demand as a speaker nationally on behalf of former slaves. And Clarke's notoriety and influence was such that when he died in Lexington, Kentucky, that his passing was noted in newspapers throughout the world with full-page eulogies. I first heard of my great-grandfather when my mother would sit down with us as children, particularly during those war years when you want to keep the attention of the kids. I'm talking about the Second World War, and she would read many stories that were of interest to us. But every once in a while, she'd pull out a book called The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin that related, obviously, directly to her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, the reason why we had the key of Uncle Tom's Cabin is because there are a lot of people who felt as though what she was talking about or writing about within the book, that those things could not have happened. They're too terrible. These just must be fictitious. So she felt as though it was important for her to indicate what were the real life, experiences there, and some of the real life individuals who related, to the character. But this is what my mother would read out of this old, copy of the Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which came out in 1853. What she says here is Lewis Clarke is an acquaintance of the writer. Soon after his escape from slavery, he was received into the family of a sister-in-law of the author, and there educated. His conduct during this time was such as to win for him uncommon affection and respect. And the author, talking about Harriet Beecher Stowe, has frequently heard of him and spoken of in the highest terms by all who knew him. So anyway, we thought this was interesting. We really didn't know that there was an actual book that he had dictated. We thought when he talked in terms of a narrative, it was something that was passed on, by word of mouth to folks. But it wasn't until years later that we found out that there were a couple books that he was involved in and that he dictated for. Well, anyway, moving forward, Lewis was born to Daniel Clarke and Letitia Campbell in Madison County, Kentucky in 1815. And he was separated from the family at the age of 6. If you could show this next slide concerning the property and the estate. Am I seeing it here now? Can everybody see that? Okay. There we go. Okay, what happened here when Lewis's grandfather, passed away? He was a slave owner, of the plantation. What happened was they had to divide up the property between, some of his children, and one of them was Lewis's aunt. Her last name was Banton. Betsy Banton was her name, and so her portion of the estate is what's written out here in hand, as you can see. And you'll see notations like furniture, tobacco, a bed. There was a Negro slave girl. And then, I don't know if you can see it very well, but there's a notation of a Negro boy named Lewis, no last name, who was 7 years old. And his value was $225. So this gives you a sense of what slavery is all about. Here we're having property mixed in, with furniture, slaves and all that sort of business, and they were not considered fundamentally human. They were mere property. So that from my point of view, that gives a clear indication of what we're talking about when we talk about slavery. These people were not real human beings, to the slaveholders. When he was with his aunt, she was a mean individual, treated him very poorly. A lot of it had to do with the fact that her father had this relationship with a slave and had this baby out of wedlock, and that baby was Lewis's mother. So she would get angry every once in a while, and he didn't know why. A lot of it had to do with that aggravation she had with the father, and so he would be beaten quite often. But there are a lot of things that are pointed out within the book in relation to the terrible things that were happening to slaves, and I'm not going to go over a whole array of them, but I just want to mention a couple so you get a sense of what Clarke was exposed to, and what he witnessed. He gave the example of a slave husband, for example, that was told by the owner to whip his wife because his wife had stolen a pig and cooked it for the family. They needed food. Well, that wasn't the thing that was supposed to take place according to the owner. So he told the husband of the slave woman to beat her. Otherwise, he would be punished. And so he beat this woman and beat her so badly that it was a matter of a day or so that she died. And I'm not talking about these are exceptional things. These are the kinds of things that went on an ongoing basis. And then he gave the example of something that he said that the slaves hated more than anything else. And that is when an older woman, did something that aggravated the owner of a plantation. And usually the woman was taking care of the children and nursing the children. What they would do was line up the woman with her hands spread eagled and tied up around her wrists and also tied up around her ankles. And the children of the slave owner would then be given whips to beat the woman. And you visualize this kind of thing in relation to the children, and the children this woman has nursed. And you see other children watching this, the white children, and then the children of the slave woman watching it, and the husband possibly of the slave woman, and what that does to how they view themselves and each other. And when that kind of thing goes on for, hundreds of years, and people say, well, slavery, that's something in the past. Let's get over it. We can't keep wringing our hands about that. When those kinds of things happen, and that's embedded within the young minds of the children of God, both black and white, as well as the adults, you can't get over, something of that sort. In fact, it reminds me of what William Faulkner said about the past. He said the past is never dead. It's not even past. And then, more specifically, there are two psychiatrists, Price Cobbs and William Greer from the University of California, Berkeley, what they have to say about this issue. So the culture of slavery was never undone for either the master or the slave. The quote unquote peculiar institution continues to exert its evil influence over the nation. And, I agree, with that statement in view of what we've been seeing here, particularly over the last few years. Well, so anyway, we'll move on to it. What had happened while he was with his aunt? They were there. They were together for about 6 years or so, and then he was sold. Later on, and he was sold 2 times after that. Now, where we're going to go now for this next slide is the Garrard County building, the courthouse at Lancaster, Kentucky. Now, he had a pretty good setup because he was a weaver on the last plantation he was on. He taught how to weave, from his father, who was a weaver for the plantation of his mother. And but he heard that he was going to be sold to the south, to Mississippi, or in Louisiana. Mississippi, you had large cotton fields, and then Louisiana, you had the sugarcane fields. And he particularly, knew from other slaves that was much worse than anything that he experienced while he was in Kentucky. So he was not going to go to Louisiana. He was going to leave. And so what he had in mind when he made this conclusion was to seek out his 2 younger brothers. Before I go there, I want to talk a little bit more about this Garrard County building. If he was going to be sold again, he would be on the steps of this building, and I was hoping to be able to get a picture of that before I got this one. But anyway, this is the spot where he was sold and where they intended to sell him again. And my daughter and I went down there in I guess it was 2014 to visit that spot. And I was on that very spot where he was sold, had been sold twice. And it was the most eerie feeling, in my life. And there were some things that happened that were kind of out of body, situations. And I wanted to leave there. And I could, if you're interested, I can give you more specifics with regard to that. But anyway, he knew that he had to leave, and he had to make sure that he was going to connect with his family. There are about 8 children. They're spread out all over in that part of Kentucky and on into Ohio ultimately. So he escaped from slavery at the age of 25, and I'm not the route that he took to find out about his brothers is described in detail in the book, and I'm not going to go into that. But he was going all the way from that area of Lexington, Kentucky, up to Canada, where he had heard from the slave grapevine that that's where his brother Milton was, and then he was going to come back and bring out his next younger brother, Cyrus, who was still in Lexington. So that we're talking about, weeks and months long, trek, and really interesting how all that took place. But the first time when he got up to Canada in Essex County, Windsor, Ontario, that area, he found out, again, that Milton did not make it all the way up to Canada. And so what he had to do then was spend a little time, because the money that he had expended to get up there was pretty much gone. So he had a few odd jobs that he took on. And so he had got enough money to go back down, and, by carriage, by stagecoach and so on, and walking. But he didn't do it by horseback, because he could be arrested for being a horse thief. But anyway, he got all the way back down, to Oberlin. And the brothers, connected down there. They hadn't seen each other, for about a year or so. But there was a hotbed of an abolitionist movement, as you know, through the history of Oberlin, in Oberlin. And so what his brother Milton wanted him to do, as a result of the abolitionists asking him to tell their story, because the word had gotten out about what both of them had done, particularly Lewis. And so but they knew that the slave catchers were out, after them, particularly after Lewis. But Milton, he said, well, let's, the leaders of the abolitionist movement back east, they want us to come back there to talk about our experiences as a slave and pass them out, to other abolitionist communities. He says, I can't do that right now. I got to go get my brother Cyrus. He's down in Lexington. And so he has to go to Lexington. That's 300 miles, from Oberlin to Lexington, Kentucky. And he was told to go on a side road. I mean, the regular road was basically a side road because it was all dirt. But he had to, make sure he's going to stay away, by the advice of another slave that has escaped up Oberlin, to stay on this side road. And with the rain and mud and all that sort of thing, it was unbelievable situation that he had to go through. So we're talking about 5 days that he had at least go through that 300-mile trip. Finally was able to get in contact with his younger brother and bring him back. And he had a much more difficult time physically and emotionally doing that. That's all described, within the book, was having hallucinations and so on. So he gets back up into Oberlin. The next thing we know, that the slave catchers were out in force, to try to find both of the brothers Milton and Lewis. The younger brother Cyrus had gone on to upper New York, and so that was the situation. He was able to accomplish that. But some of the abolitionist leaders in Oberlin wanted him to continue to do some speaking there, but they said. But what happened was that the slave catchers had captured Lewis's brother Milton, but the abolitionists in Oberlin rose up as citizens and said, "No, you're not taking this Clarke." Lewis, he was probably hiding in the brush, somewhere. And so they ran them out of town. There's a lot of history about that, a lot written about what had happened there. And so the next thing, Clarke knew that he was on his way back east to New York, and then with regard to Milton, he was on his way, to Cambridge, Massachusetts, with the assistance of the American Anti-Slavery Society. So Clarke ultimately gets to New York, and he stays at the home of Lewis Tappan. And Lewis was very impressed with the background of Clarke and what his brother had done. So the word was out with regard to the abolitionist community. So he stayed at Lewis Tappan's home, who, again, I think I mentioned that he was one of the founders of Oberlin College. And so what he wanted to do was to expose Lewis to the abolitionist community throughout the Northeast. He gets in contact with Lydia Maria Child. Some of you may recall her as also an activist within the anti-slavery movement, but she was the editor of the Anti-Slavery Standard. And what Tappan wanted her to do was to make sure she was having a convention in relation to the abolitionist movement, and wanted Clarke to be a featured speaker there, and convinced Lydia Child, that's what Tappan did, to have him speak. And he spoke for 3 days. He was one of the first fugitive slaves, to stand before large audiences to talk about, his experiences. It was there in Brooklyn, New York, where he gave his 3-day exposure. He had difficulty because he didn't know how to read or write, but he was innately, intelligent. And he had a sense of humor, and so he really had, a captured audience when he was there. But it was there where the statement, when owing a shilling cost a dollar. What he explained was, he said, I've only got 1/8 of the blood. I've only got 1/8 of the blood, being the the black blood. Why do I have to pay a shilling? This is about 1/8 of a dollar. I owe a shilling. I have to be paying $1, as a full blooded slave. He was not, he was proud of his black heritage, but he thought, the craziness of coming up with this whole business of, if you have 1 drop of blood, you could become a slave. But a lot of this had to do, from my point of view, with what was happening to the cotton economy. As many of you know, Eli Whitney had invented the cotton gin back in the late 1700s. Had a major impact on the cotton industry. With that machine, it really, increased the need for more people, more individuals, more slaves, to work in that for that industry. The slave trade had stopped, as many of you know, in 1807, but between 1800 and 1850, there was an increase, from 7,000 slaves to $3.2 million. And I contend, that the reason why the slave trade had stopped, how did that number increase to those numbers? A lot of it had to do with redefining what race is all about. I haven't seen a great deal of research about it, but there stands to reason the need for more slaves. How did that increase, take place to the level that I just mentioned? So after his stay in New York with Lewis Tappan, he went to the home, as has been mentioned before, of Aaron and Mary Safford, the sister-in-law of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it was there that he dictated, there were 2 books that he dictated about his life. One was exclusively about him. If we could show those pictures, beginning, that's Lewis in 1845. And that was the same year that he published his book, Narrative of the Sufferings of Lewis Clarke. And that became a very popular book, but what had happened, it became so popular that it aggravated some people, and they burned down the press where it was printed. And so it was what they decided to do, the American Anti-Slavery Society, was to have another book that would include Milton in there, which talked about, or at least discussed in detail, the relationship with their sister Delia, and she had a really tough story to relate. But again, that's outlined within the book, but you have to look at that. So we'll look at the next picture, and this is Milton, and you can see how familiar, or how each of them looked alike. But this whole one drop rule really had a division within the family, on into the death of both gentlemen, and that is that Lewis was proud of his heritage, as when he considered himself as a black man. And Milton says, I've only got one drop of the blood. I consider myself to be a Scotsman. Okay, next picture is of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass and Clarke were colleagues. Douglass's book, his autobiography, came out the same year as Lewis's book, but Lewis's book in particular, came out, a matter of a few months before, in 1845. And as the research indicates, that Douglass used Lewis's autobiography for some background, some guidance in relation, to his. So anyway, they were on the platforms, together throughout that time in the 1840s and 50s. And another kind of an aside, both of them were somewhat related through marriage. But anyway, they were. The point is that they were fairly close. Want to go to this next picture. This is just an example of what I found, and this was in Weymouth, Massachusetts, announcing, what that means. They did hundreds of these shows, but the thing that makes this one interesting that I hadn't seen before since, and that is that Lewis, Milton, and Cyrus Clarke all spoke together. Those are the brothers he helped bring out of slavery, and related their experiences as slaves. So I don't think Clarke would have gone along with the title there, all white men. He would not have bought off on it, but Milton probably did. But anyway, it'd be interesting to see whether or not there are other notices of this sort, in looking at the history of both men. Moving on, the next picture. This is Harriet Beecher Stowe. This was taken in 1852, which is the same year that Uncle Tom's Cabin had come out. And interesting aside, Harriet Beecher Stowe got in contact with Clarke. He was speaking up in the same town that where Harriet Beecher Stowe was living. I think it was in Vermont, if I'm not mistaken, and knew he was in there. And they got together and talked. And one of the things that Lewis, he didn't know that her book was coming out, and said, "Why didn't you say more, about me and, my experience?" He said, "Well, your experience in relation to slavery was so insidious that people wouldn't have believed it. So I had to do it, my way is in essence what he said." But anyway, that's when her book came out, and as I indicated, Keydrones Cabin came out a year later. About the time of all this, taking place, the Fugitive Slave Law came out. That was in 1850. And what that reflected, what that indicated, was that if slaves were going to any part of the country, the slave owners and the slave catchers had the right to seek them out anywhere, in the nation. So they were coming all the way up to to Massachusetts, to New York, and so on. And there's also, indication, research shows that there was collaboration with the police, so-called policemen in the various cities, where they went. So it was, I guess my point is in relation to Clarke is that things were getting really hot with regard to him. So he felt as though he had to move on. That's my feeling. He was right about 1850. I think it's important to know with regard to this issue that Clarke did not want to give any legitimacy to the institution of slavery. So he did not pay his masters. His master was after him, said, you owe me money, you're my property. He said, no man has the right to own another man. So I'm not going to give legitimacy, to these laws. On the other hand, you had someone like Frederick Douglass, whose owner was after him, and Frederick Douglass went on to England, and a lot of it had to do with him trying to get the word out on his autobiography. But the owner, threatened him, he in the newspapers and so on. And so what Frederick Douglass said, he paid off his owner. That's not to say, it wasn't, the right thing, for him to do. But Lewis, on the other hand, said, I'm not going to do that because I don't respect the law with regard to slavery and the role of the so-called owner. So anyway, what Lewis did, he went up to New York, Chautauqua County, New York. If some of you may know where that's in the south west corner of the state of New York and borders on Pennsylvania. And there he started working as a conductor of the Underground Railroad in a place called Bustye. And I've been there, which is really interesting. And he worked for a man who was the chief conductor of the railroad. And he had a daughter. And Lewis married her in 1850. And it was within a 1 year time that she passed away, which is a terrible situation. And so, but Clarke stayed on there in the Underground Railroad and was working with the American Anti-Slavery Society and other similar groups to get money enough to take care of slaves that were coming up to the Underground Railroad. And he would help, provide food, clothing, and all that sort of, and help set them up to go on to Canada, leaving primarily from Erie, Pennsylvania, on into Essex County. That's where the large escaped slaves bodies or numbers of people were. And so that's what he did on a regular basis. And one thing that made the situation very dangerous was there was a group, and this is an eyewitness account, there was a group of slave catchers who were being paid by Clarke's owners to get Clarke in particular coming all the way from Lexington, Kentucky up there to Bustye. And they came into the property, and what Clarke did, he went in his back room or garage and strapped on 2 pistols, a Bowie knife, and I think a type of a sledgehammer, whatever, got on his horse and chased the slave catchers off the property. He was not a pacifist, by any means, but he was concerned that it was too dangerous for him to stay there. But he still continued to go back and forth between that Underground Railroad and into Canada. But in 1859, I guess in some of his excursions up there, he came across a woman by the name of Emmeline Walker and her father, but they were from Lexington. I don't know if they knew each other's family. They had to have some sense of having some awareness of them. But anyway, married her in Detroit in 1859, which is right across the river, the Detroit River, to Essex County. And what they did, they set up a farm there, and Clarke was an outstanding farmer, and he was helping these escaped slaves to be as good as him as farmers. And interesting stories about property that he was buying up there to help the slaves, the escaped slaves, be able to have better better lives. So they stayed there for a number of years up until 1874. And again, I don't think I mentioned this. My grandfather was born there in 1863. So all during the Civil War, that's when the majority, of the family was born, from 1859 to 1874. 1874, they decided to come back to Oberlin. And the reason why they left Canada, according to what Clarke was indicating, that there was discrimination, particularly in the school system, the segregated school system there. And I think Emmeline was getting sickly. And so they thought it would be best for them to go to Oberlin, because that's where Emmeline's sister was, Laura Walker. And so Clarke was about 65 years old, when this took place. And so that's where they were. But 2 years later, again, Emmeline passed away. And so it was very difficult for him, what to do with all the, the children there. I think you saw that picture. And so he started doing what he had been doing in the 1840s and 1850s. That is going around the nation, talking about the circumstances of the newly freed slaves, and to continue to talk about his role as George Harris and Harriet Beecher Stowe's story. So at this point, what I want to do is to show you this picture of the Oberlin, of the family when they got into Oberlin. Okay. I don't have all of the names. The two ladies, young ladies in the back, that's my mother's aunts, Violetta and Minnie, the ones that went to Oberlin. Then you see Clarke there. He has that, looks like he's trying to figure out what to do with that baby. He was sitting there in the front with the beard, and I don't know which child that is, but the ones I do know of, if you look off, to the right there, you see the tall gentleman in back. That's Cyrus, the younger brother of Clarke, and the little guy there is my grandfather, another Cyrus Clarke. Yeah, that's him, right here. And he was concerned about his father going on these trips, around the country. But to bring this, so that's the family, and I think that picture came from the Oberlin Library, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, that picture is well known within the family. What Clarke did was go on these tours, and he was connecting with dime museums. Those, I don't know if you've heard of those dime museums, were for people who weren't as wealthy, where you would have the lower income folks that would learn about education, have performances, and what Clarke did. Well, look at this next picture. Here he is on a spinning wheel. He was an expert at the spinning wheel. In fact, won contests up in Canada for his skills at that. But what he would do is regale the audiences that came to these things at these dime museums, and talk about his history as a slave, and his story about George Harris and his connection with Harriet Beecher Stowe. So that went on, those kinds of things went on pretty much until close to him passing on. Well, Clarke moved away from Oberlin because the children were getting older, and so they were going off in another direction. So he felt as though he'd go back to his hometown in Lexington, and that's where he did. He came upon hard times, and word got out. There was a reporter, to make a long story short, there was a reporter found out about his situation. He was renting out a house he owned, and the fellow that was living there had taken off, and the house began to burn down. But anyway, this reporter saw him at one of the government buildings down there. I think it was registering to vote. And the question was asked, who is that, interested looking man? So that's George Harris of Uncle Tom's Cabin. One of the clerks there, knew that. And so what had happened, he interviewed him, he told him all that was going on, and it created a story that went viral throughout the world, in fact. And one of the questions in relation to stories, why is this famous man, living in such, terrible economic circumstances? And it was Harriet Beecher Stowe helping them in any way. So anyway, that created quite a story, detailed, again, within the book. But there was a financier, in New Zealand of all places, who read about the story and said, I'm going to give this man some money so he'll live in comfort for the remainder of his life. And that's exactly what had happened. But Clarke passes away in December of 1897, laid in state by order of the governor of Kentucky. And I don't think there had been any African-American or anybody else who had laid in state by order of the governor in Kentucky before or since. But that's what happened. That had national coverage. And he was eulogized at the St. Paul's AME Church. We can look at that next slide. And that's me in front. My daughter took that picture. So they had a beautiful coverage there, a sermon and so on. And a lot of people, black and white, came to the funeral. And that was again in 1897. And he was so he laid in state there for a bit, and then his brother, I should say his son James, came down from, I think he was in Oberlin also, and took his remains back up to Oberlin so he could be buried next to Emmeline and at the Westward Cemetery. And I was able to get a headstone. Emmeline did not have a headstone. Nobody in the family knew about it. I had to find out from the fellow who's running, the seminary, to find out exactly where she was. There are a number of children that are buried there too, and this is kind of typical of black, what they do, black bodies at cemeteries. There's a lot of folks buried in these places that no one knows about, but I was able to get it for Emmeline right next to Clarke's burial site. So this next picture is Clarke, and that's the 1895. He lived a very healthy life. He was way into his 80s when he passed on. But he is a person whose story I respect and admire so much, and I'm just am proud and pleased to be able to have the opportunity to talk about what he contributed to our broader family and what he contributed to the United States. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I know you were just working from the surface in what you were sharing tonight. So those in the audience, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, just I appreciate the words. Now, if there's some questions, that would be great.
Yes, so you're welcome to type questions into the Q&A box, or I'm not sure if I can allow you to unmute yourself, but I will try to do that. You can also use the raise your hand feature, and then I can unmute you when I see you have a question. But we do have two in the Q&A box, so I will start with those. So one from Linda Schultz. What was the Canadian government stance on slaves coming to their country?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There was no slavery there in Canada, and so I didn't get any information that, for example, if the slave catchers came across the border, seeking the slaves, I wasn't able to get any information along that line. But slavery was not in existence there, as I have investigated, in fact. But one thing that Clarke did point out was that there was discrimination in the school system, and he was concerned about that with regard to his children. And as I mentioned, that was one of the reasons why he came back. But people, had assumed that was nirvana in Canada, but not necessarily in terms of things like education. There may have been others, but there's no no indication of any pushback with regard to the issue of slavery, or at least any collusion with the United States government when it came to that kind of.
Another question was, what is the title of your book?
The title of the book is When Owing a Shilling Costs $1, the Saga of Lewis Clarke, born a quote unquote white slave. When Owing a Shilling Costs $1, the Saga of Lewis G. Clarke, born a quote unquote white slave.
I don't think there's another question in the Q&A, but I'm going to sneak one in myself. It sounds like you had been told some stories within the family. I'm curious, what really struck you once you started doing research? Was there differences?
Well, this is there weren't any differences within my immediate family. It was a lack of information about him. My mother never mentioned, for example, that there had been a book that he had dictated, that he had published. Like I said, they thought it was passed on word of mouth. So that was interesting. And he didn't find out about any book until about 1970, when the son of one of her aunts, one of Lewis's daughters, came up to Seattle because of a mutual acquaintance who were active in the AME church, and he came. Make a long story short, he came up to Seattle and said, I've been able to find this book, called The Narrative and Suffering of Lewis Clarke. And we didn't have any idea that was, in existence. But I should say, though, it wasn't the original book of Lewis Clarke. It was Lewis and Milton Clarke. We didn't know that there was an individual book that was made, that was published in relation to Lewis. So anyway, and then I had talked to embellish this a little bit, I had talked to my old history teacher who was from Tennessee, Harvard, PhD. And I told him about this book. I said, this is wonderful. And he wasn't too enthusiastic about it, because he said the abolitionists tend to exaggerate their stories, and so, it's they did admire somebody like Douglas, or at least this professor did, because he was a very highly educated man and just an outspoken orator, a great orator, and so on. So he didn't have the kind of legitimacy, that he felt was necessary for to take the book seriously, this autobiography. But years later, I was teaching down in Florida at Florida State University, and I came across a history professor down there, and I asked him what his background was and his area of expertise, and he said the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction and slavery. And and I said, well, gosh, I have a relative. You wouldn't know anything about. I have a relative who was active in the abolitionist movement, and but this is his family lore. You wouldn't know anything about it. He says, well, give me a name. Who is he? He said, I might know about him. Yeah, I said, Lewis Gerard Clarke. He says, gosh, Carver, he says, I'm working on a project at Yale University with the Frederick Douglass Papers, and I'm part of this team, and they're gathering information about Black abolitionists, and I know all about we're talking about 3,000 miles away. He said, I know all about Lewis Clarke. And he had all of these articles and papers and all sorts of stuff about him. And then that's the time that I really realized that this is a very important man in relation to United States history, and important in relation to slavery. So, but he gave me all these papers, but I was not able to do anything with it for a number of years, because I was teaching at Florida State, then went on to Owing, was there for almost 20 years. And so it was just in relatively recent time I was able to gather more information. But when I opened up the Northwest African American Museum, there was a picture in the paper about me, And I had this you've seen that, the profile picture of me with Clarke. And so there was a historian from Sugar Grove, Pennsylvania, who got in contact with me. And he said, I saw this picture and from the Seattle Times about you opening up this museum, and said, I have information, about your great grandfather. Also, he's considered a hero in this area, in Sugar Grove and West Side. And years later, I had to go to Buffalo, and I went to see a family on that property where he had his Underground Railroad. And the folks there knew all about him. And he pointed to some trees that were planted, maple trees that were planted, in front of the property. And they said that those trees were planted, because I had read about the trees that he planted there in that spot. He said those trees were planted there in 1850. So I probably should have one of those pictures, but I have a picture of that family. And then another family who were related to Milton Clarke, their direct relationship, but a woman got in contact with me too through the internet. I'm this one on Ancestry. And she says, I think I'm related. I think my husband is related to you. They had no idea they had any Black blood in them, at all. And so this woman had done all this background information and goes and takes the family back, the Campbell side of the family, which is the Campbell was Clarke's grandfather, all the way back, to the fourth, fifth and fourth centuries. So, so it's interesting how this kind of thing, takes place. So, but for some reason, my mother had to known about this Milton family, who would consider themselves white. They did not want to announce anything. In fact, there was a newspaper article that Milton put in when he was in Cambridge, saying he didn't want anybody inquiring about his family. This is at the height of the Jim Crow era. And he didn't, he felt that if he came out, he said, that he had been a slave, but he didn't want anybody, to know that he had Black blood. He didn't want any pushback, any tough times, on the part of his children. And so they just kind of went underground, from 1900 all the way till 2-3 years ago. Anyway,
We did have 4 more questions pop up in the Q&A, so we'll see if we have time to get to them all.
Okay.
The first one was, I think, what are your thoughts or opinions about the book Uncle Tom's Cabin and its portrayal of Clarke, Uncle Tom, and Harriet Beecher Stowe's relation to Clarke in general?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think the way that the book has been portrayed, or I should say as Uncle Tom, the use of the word Uncle Tom is came from probably from another direction in relation to the story. And let me explain. If you read the actual book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, when it came to Uncle Tom was in essence a hero, because he got beaten to death because he was trying to protect 2 slave women who had escaped, and Simon, Legree, and I think he had some, Black slaves that beat him to death. He was beaten to death because he would not say anything about where they went. Now, to take that a little bit further, those dime museums that I talked about, they kind of morphed into these these sideshows that I think really the Southern and tends to be racist communities kind of took over the broader concept of Uncle Tom's Cabin and turned Uncle Tom into what we today think of somebody who's just kowtows to folks and was a weakling and so on and so forth. But if you read the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, Uncle Tom was by no means that. And in fact, if you read when Owing and Shilling Costs $1, he has the and I think his name was Pete in the book, and the exact things that were happening to Uncle Tom and Harriet Beecher Stowe's a book was that same thing was happening to this individual that Clarke described in his book of the beating that he took place, and the words that he says, God, I hope God will forgive these people, for doing this, to me. And then there was similar wording within Uncle Tom's Cabin. Sam Pete was, so check that out, in the book, very similar to what happened to Uncle Tom in Harriet Beecher Stowe's book.
Another one was Oberlin College admitted Black students. Were the schools in Oberlin for younger students likewise open to Black students?
As I understood, the Oberlin school was open to both Black and white students, and well as women from the beginning. That's my understanding, but.
And I can also chime in from the Heritage Center. We have seen newspaper articles indicating that the lower schools, younger students were also integrated.
Yeah, I mean, that was revolutionary, quite frankly, yeah.
Another question, how much did it typically cost to buy your freedom?
Well, different age levels. For example, Clarke, he was worth, according to that paper that you saw, $225, and he was 6 years old. Okay, I think what Clarke indicated in his book, as I recall, his last sale was $1,250. I think it's hard to make a judgment as generally what the price was. It was probably how the owner conceived of of the value is what it boils down. Other than that, I can't speak more directly with regard to that.
And probably our last question for the night. And then, so everyone listening, I will try to open the chat feature. So if you'd like to send any remarks to Dr. Gayton, you can do so. But this last question is from Marian Cunningham. The images you shared were great. I especially like the 3 images of Lewis, Milton, and Frederick Douglass that were detailed portraits of their faces, yet their lower bodies were simple sketches. Where did you find the images?
I think I found them at different libraries, if I'm not mistaken. I did a lot of research with regard to. I can't give the specifics because there's a mixture between newspapers and libraries and so on. But there should be some indication, I think, under the each one of the pictures. As maybe those details could be sent to you. But I think under each one of the pictures it shows the source, I think.
I don't think they were included in this presentation, but I know the one of Lewis.
If you look in the book, that's a good.
Yeah.
Look in the book. It indicates where I got it from, so you might be able to, at least get some sense of that.
That was a great plug there. I like it.
Yeah, and you didn't set me up for it at all.
Yeah. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your passion and your research and your energy with us here tonight, because this is interesting history and still, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think so very important to still be talking about today.
Well, thanks so much, Liz. I appreciate your asking me, and it's always my pleasure. And I hope to get back down to Oberlin here within the year at least.
Wonderful. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you, Liz. Bye-bye.